Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB.
And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're covering the Easter family massacre, the case of James Ruppert. James Ruppert murdered 11 of his family members on Easter Sunday in 1975. And I know that we all just got done celebrating Easter, and that we're all probably just now getting all of the straw grass cleaned up from every crevice of our house, but I figured what better time to do an Easter murder than the Wednesday after Easter. We've all eaten and gotten everything cleaned up and sent some of those annoying family members back to their own houses. And besides, there's no better time to remember to enjoy your family members than right after the holidays have just passed. So regardless of if you and your family celebrate Easter or not, let's get it. James Ruppert was born to his parents, Charity and Leonard Ruppert, and I found a few different conflicting reports about James's actual birthday. The majority of the sources that I saw listed his birthday as March 29th, 1934. But the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation has his birthday listed as April 12th, 1934. But I've seen this in a few other old cases where like a baby would be born at home and it would take parents like a few weeks or even a few months to get to the closest hospital in town to have the baby actually declared born and a birthday given to them. I've also seen situations where somebody would have their birthdays forged in order to get married like before they were 18 or, something along those lines. I actually know somebody who was able to change her birthday on forms so she could get married. And apparently, not many questions were asked about stuff like this back in the day, so nobody was really any wiser about it. So it could have been something like that. So this isn't really the weirdest thing I've ever seen, but there are a few different reasons that I could think of why his birthday would be listed differently in different places. But regardless of all that, James was for sure born in 1934 at the very least. The actual date of his birth, as far as the month and day goes, questionable. But when James was born, it seemed like his mom and dad were pretty disappointed that James wasn't born a girl. And it seems like the way that James's mom, Charity, was looking at it was like she'd already had a son. She already had a son. She had one older son before she had James. So this time she wanted a girl and James had came out a boy. So she was openly not happy about it, and it was not a secret. The entire Ruppert family lived in Hamilton, Ohio for the most part of their lives, but growing up, James was told constantly by his mom that she'd wished he had been a girl. And I feel like as parents, we've all been there, like we would want a boy or a girl, and then we end up with a little squishy ball of perfection of the opposite sex, and we end up like forgetting about, what we wanted to start with, like it doesn't matter anymore. I was one of the lucky ones. I never wanted a girl, and I was lucky enough to have 2 boys during both of my unexpected, unplanned pregnancies. Thank you, Lord. But James's mom, she was not shy about telling anybody who would listen that she wished James had been a little girl when he was born. And throughout James's entire childhood and even into adulthood, which is weird, it's very evident that James's older brother Leonard was the family's chosen golden boy. Leonard Jr. did absolutely nothing wrong, and he was exactly what his parents expected out of their child. And like I said, I feel like this is something most parents let go after their kid's born. We see the precious new baby and we instantly fall in love. Boy, girl, no matter the gender, I feel like most parents see their baby and they instantly forget about the sex of the baby that they were hoping for. But not in this case, not at all. James's mom, Charity, would tell anybody and everybody that, she wanted a girl and she expected James to be a girl. She told this to everybody, including James. James grew up knowing full well that he was a disappointment to his mom before he was ever able to actually disappoint her. He also grew up full well knowing that she'd wanted him to be a girl, but I don't understand how you tell your kids that they're a mistake. James hadn't even had the chance to disappoint his mom already before he was considered a disappointment to her. He was like a baby, an infant, a toddler, and even into his school-age years. I mean, it's not like he can control the gender he was born as. But throughout his entire life, James's mom, Charity, always made sure to reiterate the fact that she'd wished he'd been born a girl. But I just keep asking myself, what was the point that Charity was trying to make? What was the point in her berating her son around and trying to embarrass him and, trying to make him feel ashamed that he had been born a boy instead of a girl? I don't understand what the end game was. I don't understand what she was trying to accomplish. You know what I'm saying? I just don't get it. Nothing good can possibly come from that. And I know this was back in the day, 40s, 50s, 60s. But parents would still have to have known, even back then, that this was absolutely no good for your kid. They were from a different generation, sure, but they weren't stupid. Because think about it, if you're constantly told that you're never going to amount to anything, you're always going to be worthless, and that you'll never be anybody, once you hear those things for so long, so often, you kind of start believing them yourself, and you kind of unconsciously manifest all these negative things that you're so used to hearing. So now you're manifesting this into your life, and that's how it's going to turn out, because James didn't end up doing much with his life, and he didn't accomplish great feats. Actually, he was kind of a loner and a bum, honestly, but that could have a lot to do with his parents and how they talked down to him and treated him, because if the things that James says about his childhood are true, because that's the only account we have, because he killed everybody else, that's not funny, that was uncomfortable laughter, don't at me about it. So, everything from his childhood is from James's point of view. It's even said that James's mom would go so far as to dress James up as the little girl that she'd always dreamed of. And now it's 2023. If you want to paint your 2-year-old little boy's nails pink and he wants to wear frilly pink dresses, it's really not that big of a deal. It's not overanalyzed, it's not overthought like it was back in 1934. But in 1934, boys were to play with trucks and like the color blue and red, and girls were expected to play with dolls and to like the colors pink and purple. But that did not seem to matter much to Charity even in 1934. And in a situation like this with James's mom, you would kind of hope that his dad, Leonard Sr., would have been his saving grace, but that wasn't the case either. James's dad was quick to tell both of his sons that they were disappointments and that they'd never be anyone and that they'd never amount to anything. Which seems like a good, quick, and easy way to fuck your kid's head up. But what do I know? I'm just a mama. So, neither of James's parents are winning any Parent of the Year awards. James's dad raised chickens inside of the barn that the family lived in, and this was kind of how he supported the family. James suffered from extreme asthma, and the chickens, their feathers, their fecal matter being all in the air in their house could have been the reason that James wasn't quite as big as other kids his age. It could have possibly stunted his growth some, but there's no way to know that for sure. That's just me speculating. But from what I could find, James was always a pretty sickly kid, and it seems like because of the asthma that James wasn't able to play any sports or really do much of anything. It kind of seemed to hold him back in his personal life and his development as far as being like in relationships with other people, which is something that most kids learn at an early age from like play dates and school friends, but James had neither of those things. James's dad, Leonard Sr., passed away when James was 12 years old, and his dad had passed away from tuberculosis. Tuberculosis? Did I say that right? I think. This would leave James's 14-year-old brother, Leonard Jr., to play the role of the man of the house. And Leonard Jr. learned his abusive and demeaning ways from their dad. And from here on out, since James's dad is deceased, I'll be referring to James's older brother, Leonard Jr., as just Leonard. It's a lot easier on the tongue. And it kind of seems like James's older brother Leonard may have been worse than their dad. But then again, we have to keep reminding ourselves that all of these accounts from James's childhood came straight from James and nobody else was around to corroborate or, dismiss any of it. So we only have James's version of events about how his childhood went. And you know what they say, there are 3 versions of the truth. Your version, my version, and the truth. So there's no telling really how much of James's account from his childhood are true and how much of his recollections are fabricated so that us, the listeners, feel pity for him and how he was raised as a child. So take all these horrible things that may or may not have happened to James during his childhood and teenage years with a grain of salt. And I say that Leonard may have been worse than their dad because according to James, his older brother Leonard would lock him in closets, sit on top of him, and physically abuse him. And it seems like from James' account of how he was treated as a child that it was more like torture. But again, we don't have any other family to cross-check these facts with. Although neighbors and family friends said that they never really seen anything out of the usual from James or his older brother Leonard. Also, according to James, his dad was pretty standoffish with him and his brother Leonard. Like, he didn't really have much to do with either one of the boys, but when he was talking to either one of the boys, or around either one of them, that their dad was pretty abusive. And it seems like when their boys' dad died, that James's older brother Leonard just kind of took over the role of anything that their dad would have normally done, including being abusive and demeaning towards James, for all of his many shortcomings. So, like I said, we'll probably never know the truth about how he was raised and if his brother was actually this awful or not, but it seems like from what I could find that James's brother Leonard was pretty athletic in school and that James was more the shy, quiet type, which also aligns with what neighbors and family friends said about James growing up. Everybody kind of agreed that James was the quiet, well-to-do type, and that Leonard was the outgoing, energetic, and more likable and more lively of the two boys. Which is normally how that works. You have, like, polar opposite kids. Like, I have my two kids are the exact definition of polar opposites. I feel like it's like that for a lot of people, and I'm not sure why. James was kind of picked on as a kid and into his early teenage years because he was awkward and because he wasn't at all athletic. But not just because he wasn't athletic, though. He was also pretty short for a man, even into adulthood. James was always on the shorter side, and his brother Leonard was, like, tall, built, and broad. And James was the complete opposite of that. Not that this part really matters, but as an adult man, James was only about 5 foot 6 inches tall, and he weighed in at about 135 pounds. And while I don't think this is very important, I think James already felt like such a failure that this was just yet another shortcoming for him. Kind of like one of those situations where he felt like he couldn't win for losing. So while me or you may not think that James's weight or height is really relevant, James probably most definitely felt like he'd gotten the short end of the stick in every situation in life, everything, with everything. And teachers that taught both boys in school would even compare James's school abilities to his older brother Leonard's school abilities, which is also not cool. Don't do that. And at just 16 years old, things were so bad at home for James that he ended up running away from home. And he even attempted to hang himself with bed sheets. This suicide attempt was unsuccessful, and James inevitably went back home to live with his mom and his older brother. And things continued like this for James up into adulthood. And I know I keep harping on things that James did or didn't do right, but he's also a mass murderer, so, like, boo-hoo for him. Because all of his shortcomings come into play later during his many trials that James got for these mass murder charges. As James got older and out of high school, he attempted college courses, but he flunked out 2 years into his studies. And that's fine. College isn't for everybody. I never went to college. I'm doing just fine. But while James was flunking out of college just 2 years in, his brother Leonard was busy getting a degree in electrical engineering, which he did successfully. So now this is just yet another shortcoming on James's part. Now, James is a college dropout, and his brother Leonard has a degree in electrical engineering. It doesn't seem like James was dumb, but he was a loner and he liked to be by himself. It seems like James used all of these really small things to make himself feel less than, and like with the way that his parents talked to him, I could see probably why he felt that way. Something that probably made James feel even worse about himself is the fact that James had really only been in a few relationships in his life, and one of those relationships was allegedly with a woman named Alma. And I say allegedly because I only saw this in a handful of places, and it was really hard to fact check. But later, after we talk about the murders, I kind of believed it just for one reason, which I'll get to. So after Alma and James had already been dating, James introduced Alma to his mom and his brother Leonard. And after Alma and Leonard met, those two started dating. And once again, James got the short end of the stick with his girlfriend too. Alma and James's older brother Leonard went on to get married. So James's brother Leonard married one of James's only girlfriends. And Leonard didn't just marry Alma, he went on to have 8 whole-ass kids with her throughout their course of their marriage to one another. Things continually got worse for James, and he had a few pretty good jobs in his day, but those jobs never lasted, and he was either fired or he quit all of them, which is exactly what James's dad had always told him would happen. James was in his 30s when he started getting extremely paranoid, or so he claims, but we'll get back to the paranoia thing too. But the paranoia was definitely going to keep growing over the next few years, and we'll get there. I'm jumping ahead of myself. We'll get there. So between 1973 and 1974, the stock market had completely crashed. And that left James unemployed, and he resorted back to having to live with his mom. The same mom that had always wanted to make sure to let him know how big of a disappointment he was to her. But James wasn't just unemployed and back at home, he was also having to borrow money from his mom and his brother just to make ends meet. But James wasn't using this borrowed money to help with bills or groceries. He was drinking all of the borrowed money away. He was hitting all of his favorite local bars and day drinking it up on everybody else's dime. James was living at his mom's rent-free, and she was tired of him drinking every dollar that he had away. And I'm not sure how James had the money to be a gun enthusiast or a collector of guns, but somehow he did. And I say that because my husband is very much a gun collector, and we have entirely too many guns for one house, but it's definitely not a cheap hobby to have. Either way, James had tons of guns and an unstable and probably undiagnosed mental health problem, but, it's the 70s. Live long and prosper. So eventually, James's mom, Charity, was finally like, you're going to have to get a job or pay rent or get the hell out. Which makes sense, especially since he's a 41-year-old man. Like, this wasn't a situation where James was 19 years old and fresh out of college and needed to fall back on some help from his mom for a while until he got on his feet. No, this was a 40-something-year-old man who wasn't looking for a job and wasn't trying to fix his situation. So there's a big difference there. So it's 1975 now, and life for James is about the same as it has been. He's still drinking his meals away, and it seems like his drinking had gotten worse over the last few months, and he was drinking daylight to dark now. The drinking didn't help with James's paranoia, and he'd often go out and line up empty drink cans to use for target practice, and he would shoot these targets for hours and hours at a time. And he did this because he swore that everybody was out to get him, especially his mom and his brother. It was March 28th, 1975, which was one of James's possible birthdays because remember, his actual birthday was unclear in my research. But on March 28th, 1975, James went out to shoot guns, which wasn't out of the realm of normal daily activities for an unemployed James. When he finished shooting and doing target practice, James hit up one of his usual watering holes to drink away his sorrows. James hung out until last call at about 2 or 2:30 a.m. that night before he headed back home to his mom's house. The next morning was Easter Sunday, and James was in his room sleeping off the drinking bender that he'd been on the night before, and he slept well into the evening hours. And while James was sleeping off the drinks, his brother Leonard and his wife Alma and all 8 of their kids showed up at James's mom Charity's house to celebrate Easter together. Leonard and his wife Alma's kids all ranged in age from 4 years old to 17 years old. So they were having a kid like every other year or so. And it's not weird that Leonard and Alma would be gathering at James's mom's house. Leonard was her son too, and her favorite son at that, and most grandmas live for their grandchildren, so of course they gathered at Grandma's house for Easter dinner. The kids had hidden Easter eggs, and Grandma Charity went into the kitchen to start making the kids some sloppy joes. And sloppy joes don't exactly scream Easter Sunday dinner to me, but this could have been like a quick lunch to hold the kids over until dinner, or this could have been a situation where Leonard and Alma had already visited with other family members earlier in the day, and that maybe they had already eaten their big meal for the day. I'm not exactly sure why they were cooking sloppy joes on Easter Sunday, but I can think of about 100 different scenarios where I can make that make sense in my head. So I didn't really question that part or even look into it much more than just seeing it in a few different places. Most of the kids had gathered in the living room, probably eating their boiled eggs and Easter candy if I were guessing. And all the adults were just kind of hanging out in the kitchen, finishing up the sloppy joes. At some point during the family holiday commotion, Leonard asked James how his Volkswagen vehicle had been running lately. And with that one simple question, James walked upstairs and headed back into his bedroom. When he returned a little while later, he wasn't coming back down just to hang out in the kitchen with his family. He had actually gone to his bedroom to get his .357 Magnum. He also had 2 different .22 caliber pistols, handguns, and some kind of rifle. And while my husband is very much into guns, I know how to shoot and use them, but I'm not an avid gun girl, so these were all he just brought down a shit ton of guns. Now, all of these multiple different guns that James had brought out of his bedroom with him had been previously loaded. So he carried 3 pistols and a rifle into a room where his entire immediate family were all just sitting and hanging out, enjoying each other's company during the holidays. And without warning and without hesitation, James shot his older brother Leonard in the head. Once his biggest lifetime competition had been taken out, James then shot the woman that had betrayed him by choosing his brother to marry over himself all those years ago. And Alma was the next one of James's victims to be shot. But Alma was shot in the heart and not the head like Leonard had been. And I feel like this says something about the way that he felt about Alma. Every one of James's victims were shot in the head except for Alma. Alma was the only one who was shot in the heart. And after he felt like he'd proclaimed some kind of justice against his older brother Leonard and his long-lost love interest Alma, James turned the gun on the woman who had always told him that she'd never really wanted him anyways, and he shot his mom Charity in the head. With all of the noise and chaos going on in the kitchen, some of the older kids had come into the kitchen to, I guess, kind of see what was going on. James then shot his nieces and nephews one by one. James shot his niece Carol, who was only 13, in the head. His niece Teresa, who was only 9 at the time, was also shot in the head, along with his 11-year-old nephew David. And we later find out that it kind of seems like 13-year-old Carol had tried to escape her enraged uncle, and she'd made it as far as the door in the kitchen that led to the outside before James shot her in the head. All 5 of Leonard and Alma's other kids were still in the living room at their grandma's house when James walked into the living room and shot his remaining nieces and nephews. John, who was the youngest of Leonard and Alma's 8 kids, was only 4 years old at the time of the murders, and he was also shot in the head and killed. And it was found by police and investigators when they went into the house that John was still holding a chocolate-shaped Easter egg with the foil wrapper halfway peeled off with a chocolate candied egg that he'd never gotten to eat. From here, James shot his 15-year-old nephew Thomas, his 16-year-old nephew Michael, and his 17-year-old nephew Leonard III. The last and final victim of James would be his 12-year-old niece Anne. Leonard III was found with 3 different bullet holes in his body, and James had just successfully killed 11 members of his immediate family. He'd killed his mom Charity, his older brother Leonard, his sister-in-law Alma, plus all 8 of Leonard and Alma's kids. So I would have to assume that Leonard III was probably attempting to flee the scene to get help, which is why he had so many more bullet holes. The entire mass murder that happened only took between 3 to 5 minutes. There had been more than 35 shots fired inside of that house on Easter Sunday. James had shot everybody once to kind of immobilize them, to try to keep them from fleeing or getting away, and then after they weren't able to flee or fight any longer because of the bullet wounds, James slowly and one by one shot everybody a second time in the head, and some of his family members were even shot a third time. Once James knew that everybody was completely dead, he lounged around his mom's house on the couch for more than 3 hours, thinking about his next move. James laid on the couch for a while. He went upstairs to his room and changed his clothes. Then he went back downstairs to straighten the house up some. According to James, he had contemplated killing himself, but he said that he couldn't bring himself to do it because it would be the ultimate immortal sin. So, not like killing 11 members of your family is any type of sin or anything, but whatever the reason, it seems like James knew he wasn't going to try to run from the crime scene, which I don't really know how far he would be able to run from this one. It also seems like James knew that he wasn't going to try to come up with some elaborate story. He just wanted some time to think about his life before he called the police to report the murders. And he did eventually call police a few hours after he'd killed his entire family. At 9:30 p.m. on Easter Sunday, James did finally call to report the murders, and he just kind of relayed that there had been some family members shot and that bodies were everywhere. He also said that he would be there waiting on them to arrive. And this was true. James just sat around and waited for the police to get there. And there are a few differing reports about what James actually said when he called to report the murders, but in both versions of what James supposedly said when he called to report the murders, he never admitted guilt in any way, shape, or form to, the dispatcher or the police. So I saw one supposed quote more than any of the other ones, and this one says that James allegedly said, quote, "She's dead, he's dead, they're all dead." And the only other one that I saw reported enough to mention was that he just said something along the lines of, they're all dead. But we don't know this for sure either way, and it seems kind of irrelevant now. So when police got there, there were absolutely no clear signs of a struggle, and nothing more than an overturned trash can was out of place throughout the entire house. Seasoned officers and detectives were adamant that the images of that entire family strewn through the house haunted them until the day that some of them took their last breaths. Bodies lay around the house in the same places where they had fallen from being shot, and the walls and floors were covered in blood. With the amount of people inside of that house and the amount of time that James waited to call 911, the blood of everybody in James's family had soaked through the floors of the house and were dripping through the basement ceiling down the walls. This was a sight that none of these officers would ever forget. As soon as the first responding officers walked up to the house, they could immediately see 2 dead bodies laying behind James inside the house as he just stood outside and talked to them casually. Police would go on to find a total of 11 bodies inside this 2-story house. 6 bodies were found in the kitchen area, and 5 of the other bodies were found in the living room area. And unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about Leonard, Alma, Charity, or any of the other kids. It was a different time, and your business was just that, your business. So I couldn't find very much information on the victims, which sucks. But as James stood with the first responding officers, and still without admitting guilt, James never told the first responders that he was the one who'd murdered his family. He did tell them, however, that his mom had driven him crazy and tried to turn him into a homosexual. And my guess with the homosexuality statement would be about, a lot of the times that his mom would tell him she wished he was a girl, times when he was made to wear dresses, whatever. So it sounds like his childhood did suck, but so does a lot of people's childhood, and that's not a good enough reason to murder everybody in your entire family. That is insane. And regardless of whether he was gay or not, is completely irrelevant. He may have been and he may have not known how to express that then, also still irrelevant. Police loaded James into the back of a patrol car and, they started taking in the crime scene. All 4 guns were strewn around the house, and the pan of sloppy joes was still sitting on the stovetop. It was found that all 11 victims had been dead for at least 4 hours. And also that 10 out of the 11 victims were shot in the head, except for one, Alma, which was his sister-in-law. And that's like I was saying earlier, this could have been because he still had some kind of feelings for Alma, because again, she had dated James first before he introduced her to Leonard, and then she dumped James like a sack of hot potatoes. So it could have been that he still had feelings for Alma, or it could have very easily been some kind of resentment towards her for choosing Leonard over him to begin with. We'll probably never know. Police collected the guns and the shell casings from the gunshots that were laying around the house, and here is where they were able to determine that everybody had been shot multiple times. James didn't really answer questions or participate in any of the police interrogations or interviews. He didn't even really say much in court. He just kind of told the police that his mom had driven him crazy and that she'd try to make him gay, and that was really about as far as his cooperation went with the police and the investigation. James was arrested either the same day as the murders or early into the next morning hours after the murders, and he was charged with 11 counts of aggravated homicide. After looking over the crime scene, Hamilton Police Chief George McNally said, quote, "We can't seem to find a motive for this. This kind of murder usually has a motive, like sex, greed, or jealousy. We can't find any of those things here. Some aspects of this case just leave us puzzled." So as police dig through evidence and talk to friends and family and neighbors of the Ruppert family, they find that James had spoken to an employee by the name of Wanda at the bar that he'd visited on March 28th, just the day before the murders. James told this bar employee Wanda about how his mom had been nagging him to contribute to the living expenses, or she would have to start the eviction process. And it's reported that James told this employee at the bar that he was working on fixing some of his life problems and that he needed to find a solution to solve these problems. James left the bar for a short period of time, and when he came back and talked to Wanda again, she asked if he'd had a chance to fix any of his life problems. James told Wanda that he hadn't had a chance to fix them just yet, but that he was working on it. So he absolutely had to have been planning this mass murder, which makes it all the more worse because his nieces and nephews were innocent bystanders in this murder. And it's not like he killed the kids to avoid leaving any witnesses behind, because he basically turned himself in. So what was the point in killing the kids? It doesn't make sense. I mean, not that killing your mom and your brother makes much sense either. Like, just cut ties with them and let it be. It's not that hard. But I especially don't get why he felt like he needed to kill Leonard and Alma's kids too, though. Like, people in the community and friends and neighbors all talked super highly about Alma, Charity, and Leonard, and all 8 of the kids. People were completely outraged by this murder because this had been a well-liked and respected family in the community. Police also found that not one single neighbor reported hearing gunfire or shots being fired at any point throughout the day. And you'd have to think that with it being Easter, that people were outside with their kids, hiding and finding Easter eggs, maybe throwing something on the grill. So you would especially think that someone would have heard gunshots in this case, but no one did. It's also important to note that these houses in the neighborhood and on the road that the family lived on were all extremely close together. So you would think somebody would have heard something. And soon police would figure out why nobody heard anything. It was only about a month before the murders of James's entire family that a gun store owner recalled James asking if he knew where he could get some silencers for a few of his guns. Because in this day and age, it is extremely illegal to make, own, or sell gun silencers. But back then, silencers weren't illegal and you could just buy them. They were actually sold to help protect people's hearing if they were avid shooters, so they weren't even used to hide the sound of the guns, backfire. They were used to protect your hearing if you shot guns a lot. So remember how I told you earlier that James had been growing extremely paranoid about things in the last couple years, leading up to the murder. Well, let's talk about that for a few minutes. Because James was completely convinced that the whole ass FBI was watching and listening to him. James actually thought that the FBI had any phone that he may ever use at any point tapped. So James wouldn't use phones at the bars that he drank at. He wouldn't use the phone at his own house where he lived with his mom. He legit thought that the FBI just magically knew exactly where he would be in order to tap the phones. And this makes me wonder if this was just an extreme case of paranoia or if James was actually doing some pretty shady shit, and that's why he thought the FBI was out to get him. I don't know, just a thought though. James was also convinced that his brother Leonard was sabotaging his car and his life. James thought that his brother and his mom were working together to completely destroy him. If James's car wouldn't start, he was convinced that his brother had messed with something to make the car not start. If the windshield wipers broke, then he automatically assumed that it had to have been his brother who was the one that broke them. If anything at all in James's life went wrong, he would again automatically assume that it had to have been his brother who he was sure was out to get him. And once this kind of extreme paranoia started is when James started his excessive drinking, and this is also about the same time that he started collecting guns. So, paranoia, drunk, gun collector? That's a good mashup. Let's do that. So, according to James, he had been downstairs with the rest of his family right before the murders. And he had been planning to load his guns up and go target practice shooting. But James says that right before he went upstairs to get his guns to leave for target practice, that Leonard asked James something along the lines of, "How's that Volkswagen running?" And James took this as Leonard mocking him and kind of poking fun at the fact that he'd been messing with James's car for a while now. But in all reality, Leonard was probably just attempting to make small talk like, "Hey, how's your car running?" And James took that as kind of an omission of guilt that Leonard had been tampering with his car this entire time. So it must have felt to James like his brother Leonard was just poking the bear with this question. But his brother was probably just attempting small talk like I said. We've all done that. It's not that weird. So supposedly, this is why James went and got his guns and came back downstairs and murdered everybody in cold blood, because Leonard asked how his car was running. That's logical. Something was obviously off in James's head. And I found some things where neighbors were quoted saying that they wanted police to let James go and then kind of turn him over to the public and let the public handle him. Because when I say people were completely outraged, I mean they were irate pissed. People couldn't think of a punishment that was good enough to fit James's crimes. I even saw where a man named Donald Ruppert who was not related at all to James Ruppert or his family, but this man was harassed and bombarded by people because he had the same last name and because he also lived in the Hamilton area, which is where James and his family had lived. So this poor guy was getting threats and he wasn't able to go in public because the public was pissed, thinking that Donald was related to James. And it didn't seem to matter how many times Donald explained to people that he wasn't related to James Ruppert whatsoever and that he also had no connection to that family or that crime. It did not seem to matter. It eventually got so bad that Donald had no choice but to change his name just to get away from the harassment and threatening calls and shit that he and his family had been getting, just for having the same last name. This was the only way that he could think of to separate himself from the mass murder case. It was at James's first court appearance regarding this case that James's lawyer asked if James could be examined by mental health professionals. So it seems like they were going to go with the insanity defense, which really seems like the only option that James had. I can't think of another way that an attorney would be able to defend James without it being an insanity defense. James decided that instead of a jury trial, he was going to go for a 3-judge panel because he was found fit enough and sound enough to stand trial. And this 3-panel judge thing also seems like the only option for James as far as a trial goes, because people in the community were already harassing and threatening some random guy just for having the same last name. Of course, a jury of his peers would not be able to give him a fair and unbiased trial. So James opted for the 3-panel judge trial instead. And this trial would start later on the same year as the murders, and it wasn't very long and drawn out like they are now. The prosecuting attorneys basically came out swinging with the motive for these mass murders being money. That James would have likely not inherited anything if he'd only killed his mom, because chances are that everything she had would have been left to Leonard. Leonard was the more responsible of her 2 sons and obviously the favorite. And they were basically saying that if James had gotten away with murdering his mom, his brother, his sister-in-law, and all of his nieces and nephews, then there wouldn't be anybody else left to inherit any of the money, whether it be life insurance policies or just things of value. James stood to gain somewhere around $350,000, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm not positive that this was like a life insurance money or if it was just like money that Charity Leonard and his wife Alma were worth that James would have kind of been given if they'd all just died at random, because there would have been nobody else to leave the money to. And I didn't write the actual dollar amount down, but I'm pretty sure it was somewhere around $350,000 that James thought he would get, according to the prosecutors. And $350,000 is a lot of money today, but in 1975, it was way more than just $350,000. And of course, the prosecution called tons and tons of people to talk about how broke James was and how he'd been forced to live with his mom and so on and so forth. The defense attorneys, of course, came out guns blazing, claiming that James was insane. And I almost think that you would have to be insane to commit a crime like this. But at the same time, he'd asked for a gun silencer a month or so before the murders. And he'd also talked to the bar employee about quote-unquote fixing things that his mom had been nagging him about. And you would also have to look at the fact that 11 people were shot with James's gun, and he was the one that had called police with, all of these different kinds of evidence. Like, the defense attorney wouldn't exactly be able to walk in and say, "My client is innocent, Your Honor. I did not have sexual relations with that woman." So the only option they had was to claim that he was insane. So with all of this, all of the 3 judges that were deciding James's fate found him guilty. But they found him guilty on a 2-1 vote, so there was at least one judge in the room that was like, I don't know, maybe he didn't do it. Or maybe that one judge actually bought the insanity defense that James and his defense attorney had used. I'm not sure what that one judge was thinking, but, And the death penalty wasn't an option until the year after James was tried, so that wasn't a sentence that could be handed to James during this first trial. James was sentenced to serve 11 consecutive life sentences, but it wasn't long before James's sentence would be overturned by the Ohio Supreme Court. The Supreme Court claimed that James was unaware that he would have to forfeit his right to a jury trial if he had opted for the 3 judges. So this appeal was eventually overturned, and this would just set off a whole other chain of events in this case. So they were basically claiming that James was under the impression that all 3 judges had to unanimously agree on a guilty or innocent verdict, that he wasn't aware that it could be like a majority rules type of conviction. So essentially, they tried to claim that James didn't know what it meant when he decided against taking his case to trial with a jury. But I feel like this is something that your attorney would go over with you again and again and again before letting you rule out a jury trial altogether, but again, what do I know? James was granted a new trial, but due to the possibility of double jeopardy, the case went through appeals court and the Supreme Court system for over 2 years, just to make sure that if James was given another trial, that it wouldn't be considered double jeopardy. It was finally determined that it wouldn't be considered double jeopardy. So in September of 1982, James would get a second trial for the murder of 11 members of his family. And this second trial would be held a good distance away from Hamilton, where James and his family had lived, and away from all of the members of the community that knew James and knew the family members that he'd killed. And during this second trial, James did decide to let a jury decide his fate. So this time during the second trial, it would be a jury trial. It would be a jury of James's peers, and the trial lasted about 6 weeks. And yet again, James tried to go with the insanity defense. But something that I literally just thought about is the fact that James would have had a few pistols and one rifle, right? So he would have had to reload these guns at least a few of them, which kind of rules out not knowing what you're doing, right? Or am I overthinking that? Because I feel like reloading a gun would take enough time to kind of snap you out of whatever state of insanity that you would be in. It would take at least a few seconds of thinking and concentrating on reloading bullets into a gun that would have to slow your thinking down at least some in order for you to realize what you were doing. I don't know. Let me know what y'all think about that little tidbit, because that's not even in my notes. I just thought about that. And from what I could find, the jury members in this second trial had been taken to the house where the mass murders happened and shown the actual crime scene live and in person. Nothing had been moved or touched since the day of the murders. Even the food and shit was still sitting out on the kitchen counters. One of the media reporters that followed the jury members into the house said that the house stank of blood and that the house looked like it hadn't been touched since the day of the crime. That even the bullet holes were still there and the dried blood still filled the house. And James's defense attorney was so incredibly convinced that James was insane at the time of the crime that his defense attorney used his own money to fund different mental health professionals to come in and evaluate James. He did this in hopes that one of them would say, yes, James was insane when he committed this mass murder. But how wild is it that this lawyer is forking out his own money for psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, whatever. And during this second trial, James was found guilty for the murders of his mom, Charity, and his brother, Leonard. But James was found not guilty by reason of insanity for the murder of his sister-in-law, Alma, and all 8 of his nieces and nephews. And this time, James was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, which is completely insane to me. I don't know how you can say that, yes, he knew what he was doing when he killed his own mom and brother, but that he was completely insane when he slaughtered 8 kids and his poor sister-in-law. People in the public were not only pissed, they were a little confused about how someone could be sane for 2 of the 11 murders, and then just insane for the other 9. But I guess it was argued that James intended to kill his mom and brother, and that he just kind of snapped and killed Alma and all 8 of her kids, and I still don't see how that works. James and his defense team tried to appeal this case again on grounds of judicial error, but all those appeals were denied. And I also read that one of the jurors in the 1982 trial collapsed in the courtroom and then died from a heart attack shortly after. Which I honestly didn't look much more into that part. I was incredibly busy this week with the kids being on spring break and cooking Easter dinner for 20 people. But I do know that Alma's mom is convinced that James wasn't just guilty of 11 murders, but that instead he was guilty of 13 murders. So Alma's mom says that James should be charged with 13 murders instead of just the original 11. And she believes that he was responsible for 13 murders because of the 11 family members that he slaughtered in cold blood, and then because the fact that it was only 3 years after the murders that Alma's dad shot and killed himself in the head at 4 a.m. on Easter morning. 3 years to the day exactly after his daughter had been murdered. So Alma's mom feels like James was the reason that her husband and Alma's dad killed himself, and to top it all off, Alma's mom also thought that James was the one responsible for the death of the juror who had collapsed in the courtroom and then had a heart attack. Her mom claims that the juror probably couldn't handle seeing those graphic crime scene pictures and that those pictures are probably what caused him to have a heart attack in the first place. And sadly, she's probably not wrong. So now that we have James squared away, what happened to the house where the murders took place and what happened to the family members that James murdered? All 11 of James Ruppert's victims were buried together in Arlington Memorial Gardens, and it was only about a year after the entire family was massacred inside of this house that the house and everything in it was set up to be auctioned off. And we all know how people are like, oh, I'd like to buy Ted Bundy's Volkswagen that he lured multiple innocent women in to drive them to different locations to kill them. Yeah, that was basically how people were acting with this murder house. People crowded around and bought all sorts of things that had been inside the house when the mass murder happened. So I'm thinking something along the lines of an estate auction inside of the house where James and his mom lived. And people were super aware of whose house this was and what had happened there when they showed up to this auction. After all the material things were sold out from inside of the house itself sold separately to some people that I'll leave unnamed for their own privacy. The house got new owners in 2013, and according to them, the subfloors were still stained with the family's blood even all those years later. And the lady that owns the house now did say that multiple people stop in all the time asking to look around the house and take pictures. But she says that even though there was a whole family murdered inside of her house, that it's her house and that it's not weird for her. But the new owners didn't always know the dark history of their new dream house, though, because right before they closed on the house, a neighbor asked about James Ruppert, and the soon-to-be new owners had never heard the name before. Once they did some digging, they realized why the neighbor was asking. And once they learned the history of the house, they decided that since the house's basement was being repaired, it was being repaired before they were planning on closing on the house anyways. So they figured they'd go back by and see how the basement renovations were coming, and then they would see how they felt when they got inside the house, especially now that they knew what had happened inside the house, which is something that they hadn't known before. And when the new owner is asked about living in the house, she says, quote, "It's just proof that it happened. If I stop and think about it, sure, it's creepy and scary, but it doesn't make me feel any less safe being here." So James Ruppert was denied parole every single time that he went in front of a parole board, thank God. And for a while, I was worried that the next time that James was up for a parole, they would be like, "Oh, he's too old to hurt or kill anybody now. We should just let him go." And luckily for everybody in Ohio, James Urban Ruppert passed away in prison on June 4th, 2022 at the age of 88. Mike Grimes, who was the Butler County Sheriff Specialist, who was a detective in the summer of 1975 when the murders happened, said about James's death, quote, "It's a relief for taxpayers. They don't have to pay for him anymore." And I second that quote. And I think that is all I have for you this week. Hug your kids a little closer, snuggle your pets a little harder, and don't even trust your weird uncle. Be sure to follow the podcast wherever you listen, and please take a minute to rate and review the podcast. You can also do this wherever you already listen. It only takes a second, and it helps grow the podcast and reach a wider audience. So I think that is all I have for you this week. I hope everybody had a safe and happy Easter, and let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.